do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Aleister Crowley died on the first day of December in the year 1947 of the Common Era, at a house called Netherwood in Sussex, England, a sort of socialist artist commune run by Kathleen and Vernon Simmons, where he'd lived for the last 3 years. He was 72 years old. So who was Aleister Crowley, and why should we care about him at all? Is there any reason Crowley's not just another overappreciated dead white man? Well, he didn't exactly invent, but mostly constructed, a philosophical, magical, and spiritual practice called Thelema, which you may or may not know anything about. If you don't, relax. Many supposed adherents of Thelema don't know all that much about it either. Crowley's greater feast, that is, the celebration of the day of his death, ends up being an embarrassing holy day to a lot of adherents of Thelema. They may venerate at least a part of Crowley's work, but they don't particularly appreciate Crowley himself. Crowley had some very high-profile adherents who are very enthusiastic about a sanitized version of him. They keep at arm's length. They focus on his writings, but have created a mythical manly man version of Crowley. But they'd prefer not to talk too much about the drug abuse, multiple partners, mental issues, and insecurities. And, of course, Crowley's queer sexuality. But progressive Thelemites find him equally embarrassing. For them, the fact that Crowley could be racist and misogynistic overshadows much about him. They favor Thelema without Crowley. They'd prefer to see Crowley's role in Thelema minimized. There's just one little problem with that. That means stripping out much of Crowley's supporting writing that gives ethical and philosophical context that makes Thelema understandable. Now, Thelema isn't just your garden variety, love one another unless some man with a funny hat tells you not to spiritual practice. It's a complex, nuanced, philosophical practice. It's expert mode with all the sliders, some of which can really F things up. There may be no one right way to do Thelema, but there are definitely wrong ways, and Crowley devoted a lot of ink to trying to explain how it worked. And if you take him out of the picture, that ethical context disappears as well, and you're left with a practice that can be used to justify, well, fascism, racist nationalism, among other things. Now, you might think that makes Thelema deficient, but let's be honest, there aren't too many spiritual practices that haven't been warped to bad ends, and Thelema is actually more resistant to it than most. So, let's sort out my progressive friends first, and then spend the rest of this memorial talk discussing why Crowley is very much the prophet we both need and deserve. Now, there are two ways to look at people from history. One is to look at them in relation to our own time. Human social progress is a real thing, and we live at a time of unprecedented personal and intellectual freedom and equality. Of course, we're probably less than halfway to where we need to be, and our current model is very flawed and unequal. Our struggle is to continue to enlarge that envelope until everyone has the tools they need to accomplish their pure will. But because progress has happened, anyone from history, judged against modern people, will always be found wanting. Abraham Lincoln, who broke the back of American slavery, was outspokenly racist, by the standards of our day. The other way is to look at people from the past in relation to their own time. Sometime in the future, anything I write today will be overshadowed by my villainy. You know why? Because I burned gasoline and natural gas. Given the horrific climate catastrophe of our century, which I do know about, it will become unthinkable that any well-intentioned person could have walked out into their driveway, put a key in the ignition, and driven a gasoline-powered car. Of course, the people who judge me in the future will not understand a lot of things. They won't understand the cost of electric vehicles, the fact that electricity in my region is still generated by burning coal, and the necessity of commuting to a job. They won't understand the envelope around me that makes acceptable something which they find unthinkable. But we can, if we choose, judge historical figures not in relation to our own time period, but to theirs. We can consider if opinions that contrast with our modern values were unusual or toxic by the standards of their time, or merely examples of points where a certain person failed to rise above common and accepted prejudices. We can judge people positively by the number of times they question the prejudices of their day and how often they fought or rose above those prejudices, while understanding that people are the sum of their learning and that no one from the past knows or is going to start out thinking as we do now. If we measure him against his own day, then Crowley stands as an author who trampled most of the dominant paradigms. It is absolutely true that Crowley said things that were, by our standards, racist or misogynistic. However, as someone well-versed in the politics, culture, and literature of his life, even his most conservative opinions were typically well to the left of the social norm, and even those positions that would seem most primitive and intolerant to us today were no worse than mainstream. No thinker, no prophet, speaks in a way elevated a century or more ahead of the people around them every day in every way. Indeed, if you've ever seen David Logan's Theory of Tribes, and if not, I recommend it, you'll understand that someone who did would not be a prophet at all, because no one around them could understand them. What I take from a broad reading of Crowley's work is that he consistently questioned, picked nits with, and fought against many of the prejudices of his day, including misogyny and racism. Not all of them, and definitely not perfectly. But he stands head and shoulders above the vast majority of his contemporaries, and such that he found acceptance only among others who were very much ahead of their time. All that said, why is Crowley relevant to us today? What makes him any more memorable than any other overhyped dead white man? As we said, he did not invent but largely perfected a system of philosophical, magical, and religious practice called Thelema, and delivered a series of inspired writings, beginning but not ending with Liber Alvo Legis, the Book of the Law, which, taken together, outline the ethical practice of Thelema. Taking on why Thelema is relevant to us today is a large topic, so today I'm going to talk about 4 reasons why Crowley is relevant to us personally as a prophet. He was neurodivergent. He was insecure and depressed. He had chronic health issues and dealt with med issues and shame. And he was queer. Now, Crowley earned his living by writing, and not everything he wrote is a gem. We're fortunate in regards to some of the great prophets of the past that writing was somewhat more rare. For example, in regards to the Buddha, very few of the texts which purport to contain his words or philosophy even emanate from his lifetime, and he was the author of exactly none of them. Nobody saved Buddha's day planner. We don't have Buddha's scathing spur-of-the-moment rant about people who can't clean up after themselves in the monastic kitchen. And I'm going to use that as a jumping-off point. Crowley was born in a time that is now very remote to us. When he was born, the telephone didn't exist, nor did practical indoor electrical lighting. Houses only began to have electricity in his late childhood, and some were not electrified when he died. He was in his 20s before automobiles became common. He was born in the first great era of cheap printing, and during his lifetime, cheap reproduction, which meant anything and everything that was written is likely to have survived somewhere. In fact, a lot of his writing is lost, but he shares with the modern internet generation the assurance that his entire past would likely follow him. We're having to get used to an era in which public figures are evaluated not only for what they did yesterday, but for whatever stupid things they said in college or high school, preserved forever on the internet. And that means us too. Crowley, more than most people in his day, understood both the promise and the threat of the media, and he lived in an era when others were free to take his words and image and twist them whatever way they saw fit. He isn't hidden behind a veil of history like the Buddha. Rather, we see him warts and all, just as most of us have to deal with being seen. But let's look at the other points. Crowley was neurodivergent. Now, I'm not a psychiatrist, and I can't give a legal diagnosis for anyone living or dead. That said, in the past few years, most people who know what a video is and are watching it on the internet are going to be aware that there has been a tremendous surge in understanding across many communities of the prevalence of ASD and ADHD. Not everyone can afford a diagnosis, or has a reason to get one, but most of us have seen ourselves or our friends look at writing about these issues and say, "Oh, That explains a lot. I'm going to suggest that if you read Crowley's descriptions of his social anxieties, his tendency to get into fights with other friends because he couldn't understand what they were thinking, his seeming rudeness and bluntness while most of his close friends felt he was among the kindest of people, his difficulty at expressing emotion, inability to follow social rules, fascination with small details and patterns, and tendency to obsess and hyperfocus on certain subjects, along with his impulsiveness and lack of a natural sense of danger, it is very difficult not to see him as someone who would, in the current era, be saying, "Oh, that explains a lot." Oh, and add to that social anxiety, acting without thinking, and excessive talking. I'd also observe that mindfulness has been widely proposed as at least ameliorative in regards to ADHD, a fact Crowley discovered in his 20s. One might speculate that people do not tend to develop a fascination with a mental discipline without some predisposing need for it. I can't diagnose Crowley any more than I can diagnose my friends, but the preponderance of evidence within our communities has moved from diagnosis by a professional to, yeah, that's pretty obvious. I'm going to say the fact that Crowley was neurodivergent is so blindingly obvious in light of modern understandings, it would require a profound act of obliviousness to dismiss it. But let's break out that social anxiety and depression. Perhaps not surprisingly, as we begin to learn how these issues relate to neurodivergence, Crowley had crippling social anxiety and depression. I'm going to read a bit from his introduction to the Vision and the Voice. In the interest of time, I'm condensing a bit. You can find the original on page 13 of the Common Weiser edition. "I consider myself worth a place as a coward. What courage I have comes partly from shame, being so timid and sensitive. There are times when I cannot force myself to face a commonplace or commercial person on perfectly routine business. I have funked keeping an appointment with a girl, both when I wanted her badly and when I didn't care the toss of a coin, either for fear that she might snub or insult me, or else that I might hurt her feelings or insult her by failure to persuade her that I was the ideal man. I have turned back from a climb that I know I could do with one hand tied behind me. I have backed away with apologetic amiability from a fat, bullying blackguard that I could have and should have admonished with a hook to the jaw. I have stood hungry in front of a restaurant for fear that I might somehow make the other guests laugh. In fact, I am afraid to do practically anything which is done as a matter of course. Against this, I seem to be able to, without a moment's hesitation or fear, exactly those things which even the bravest and most powerful and free regard as unimaginably dreadful, things which they do not dare to dream of doing, even if they did would daunt them more than death. I have never failed to tell the truth or face a man when there was really danger, to act on my convictions with absolute candor in every circumstance, to take my life in my hand in the matter of mountains, oceans, rapids, wild beasts, or murderous men, and so on, without thinking twice about it. It may be that I was congenitally a coward all around, and in training myself not to turn tail, I paid attention only to the points which seemed the most serious. It should really aid diagnosis that I funk calling on a friendly publisher with a proposition which he will probably accept, to our mutual profit, but I walk straight into the lair of a creditor to tell him I can't pay him, or to Scotland Yard when someone warns me that a warrant has been issued for my arrest. These are both cases of talking business. The point may be either that suggested above, or else that I do not fear my foes, knowing they're powerless to hurt me, while my heart feigns to meet a friend, because love is my heel of Achilles. Terror, the thought that they might prove unkind or untrue, or that I myself may somehow fail to command their respect and affection. That is my vulnerable point, and there a barbless arrow, shot by a child in careless ardor, can pierce me to the quick. As to my mind, the present volume should offer some evidence as to how it is accustomed to deal with commonplace subjects. The sole result of its operations has been to assure me that it is totally useless for its presumptive purpose. So, neurodivergent and depressed. But let's keep going and talk about chronic health issues of the physical kind. Crowley was quite an athlete in his youth, primarily a climber. Even his detractors agree that he set an altitude record in a 1905 attempt on Kanchenjunga that wasn't equaled until 1922. Throughout his life, he tried to remain active, but he struggled with health concerns. We don't know precisely why Crowley had asthma, and the period explanations of the development of the disease are not entirely consistent with our modern understandings. We know that his physician prescribed him the go-to treatment of the day, which was heroin. Crowley was an on-and-off heroin addict his entire life. It's worth noting that our name for diacetylmorphine, heroin, was the Bayer Pharmaceutical trademark name, like Advil for ibuprofen. The 1921 Dangerous Drugs Acts made the over-the-counter sale of heroin illegal, leaving Crowley without an effective treatment. He continued to obtain heroin, usually through foreign medical practitioners, throughout his life, because it was the only way for him to breathe. Now, I don't know if you've ever not been able to breathe. I have this wonderful little device right here on my desk, and when my breathing gets bad, this usually fixes things right up. It didn't exist in Crowley's day. In his diary, Crowley called his attacks the Storm Fiend. But you may see where I'm going with this. Do you or any of your friends or family that you're on speaking terms with find that the ability to pursue your life's work or art is hampered by medical issues that seem to hamstring you at the worst times? Have issues with government or insurance regulations that make meds you need to thrive precarious or inaccessible? Deal with horrific side effects because it's the only way to remain productive. It's the story of our time, and in the Roaring Twenties, Crowley was right there. In July 1940, he registered with the government and was allowed medicinal heroin. A great deal is made of the fact that towards the end of his life, Crowley would do heroin in front of the guests at Netherwood. But one needs to understand that it was a prescription and came from Heppels, a reputable chemist in London. By the end of July, he made notes such as, "Another very bad night. Used 2 tablets heroin, but oh, such lots of asthma-sana." This was a German asthma inhaler that was larger, clumsier, and far less effective than mine. And that wasn't all. Just to top it off, Crowley spent most of his adult life with chronic issues from malaria. But I think we've made the point about chronic illness. Let's move on to the final of the 4 issues. Crowley was queer. He was not a gay man, and as such didn't find a firm home in the homosexual literary community of his day, though he did count luminaries such as the poet W.H. Auden and his partner Chris Isherwood, whose stories provided the basis for the musical Cabaret, as friends. As early as 1910, Crowley wrote of being a bimetallist, someone attracted to both men and women. One of his earliest partners was drag performer Herbert Pollett, known by the stage name Diane de Rougy. Wikipedia indulges in the standard safe and sanitized description. Crowley was bisexual, but exhibited a preference for women, with his relationships with men being fewer, and mostly in the early part of his life. We might note that in the latter part of his life, as he became impoverished and no longer enjoyed the impunity of wealth, homosexuality became more dangerous for Crowley, leading him to prominently display female lovers and exercise more circumspection about his male lovers. The account also clearly diminishes Victor Newberg, who was one of his longest-term partners, and rivals Leigh Herzig and Lila Waddell as the loves of his life. But more importantly, it dodges the question of the sexuality of a human who was, because of the demands of his time, forced to be performatively manly, yet was deeply aware that his nature was equally feminine and masculine. In his autobiography, he wrote, writing of himself in third person, "While his masculinity is above the normal, both physiologically and as witnessed by his powerful growth of beard, he has certain well-marked feminine characteristics. Not only are his limbs as slight and graceful as a girl's, but his breasts are developed to quite abnormal degree. There is thus a sort of hermaphroditism in his physical structure, and this is naturally expressed in his mind." Of course, here you see him desperate to affirm his masculinity. Yet he also allows that it does not fully define him. The idea of not bisexuality but non-binary sexuality was not some passing fancy. It became the cornerstone of his proposition for the new Aeon of Horus, as he summarizes in his masterwork on magic, Book 4, Part 3. 2 sexes in one person. In his commentaries on his own inspired writing, Liber Cordis Cinti Serpente, Vel 65, he says, "The male must have completed himself and become androgyne, the female and become gynander. This incompleteness imprisons the soul. To think I am not woman but man, or vice versa, is to limit oneself, to set a bar to one's motion." Now, I can't assign a pronoun to someone else, nor can I say for certain how Crowley, were he born into today's culture, would identify. But the above is a literal description of the concept of non-binary gender, and it would surprise me greatly if Crowley did not prefer the pronoun they. There are other things I could throw in. Crowley was born into a wealthy upper-middle-class family and expected to go to school and have an easy and lucrative career. Instead, he dropped out, never quite made any line of business work for him, and ended up as a literal gig worker at a time when that was done by mail correspondence. He spent most of his money financing his art projects and travel, and during the second half of his life was desperately poor and came to understand food insecurity. Some of the most questionable writing we have from him suggests that if he didn't precisely break his principles, he bent them rather severely to keep himself fed. So, why should we care about a queer person who was almost certainly neurodivergent, definitely insecure and depressed, and had chronic health issues? So, I realize everyone doesn't share this experience, but I was exposed to some Christianity as a child. It wasn't the bad sort, very little fire and brimstone, more focused on loving people and being good. Really, there was very little about it that I hated. Yet the central figure was a person who was, literally, perfect. He was unerringly kind, angry only at the right times, and with the right people. Truthfully, I liked Jesus best in Andrew Lloyd Webber's Superstar, when he was screaming at people and kicking over the tables of the moneylenders. Really, the fellow stood for some decent things. But he lectured his teachers on theology. He'd never gotten a D on a test because he'd forgotten to study, never made an ass out of himself in front of his friends by talking too much or too loud, never been rejected by anyone, or as far as the stories went, lacked the courage to ask anyone out. He was perfect. And I wasn't, so the question of what would Jesus do wasn't very relevant, because what he would do is something amazing and perfect, and I was very far from amazing and perfect. I got that it was okay because he had also already died for me, so the fact that I was effed up was irrelevant, which left a considerable question about exactly what the point of the exercise was. I had very little need of a perfect prophet who was better than I was in every way. Now, I originally had fairly little interest in Aleister Crowley, and came to him fairly late in my study of magic. I knew about him, of course, but I'd already worked the Golden Dawn grade system to the extent that it could be worked, before I came rather by accident to Thelema. But, for reasons too long and circuitous to explain in this setting, I'd grown up on a great deal of Victorian and early 20th century literature, and that instantly allowed me to place Crowley in his environment. And I admit I fell for the guy, because he was so genuinely, realistically fallible and human. Crowley is relatable. He's literally just like everyone I know. If you take those 4 boxes, neurodivergent, depressed, anxious and unhealthy, or queer, I have very few acquaintances that don't tick at least one. And the fact is that Thelema isn't a faith, it's a spiritual practice. It's to be approached with reason, and to the extent that anything about it is because Crowley said so, it's with the understanding that his commentary provided a logical consistency and clarity to a system that is otherwise little more than some open-ended poems. This was a prophet that I didn't have to revere. Nobody was going to put on a "what would Crowley do" bracelet in a non-ironic sense. That, and I could genuinely look at him and say, well, if he could buck up and get things done without the inhaler, or meds for depression, or any of the other modern marvels that alleviate our conditions, maybe I can get out of bed and do a thing myself. Certainly, there are other writers of the period I admire, but don't consider to be prophetic. I'm not precisely sure what a prophet is anyway. Of course, I know the technical definition, but I don't know what that means to us. The view that wishes to remove Crowley from the Thelemic equation altogether would regard him as sort of a flawed flesh puppet for some greater being. And of course, he thought of himself that way on occasions. One reason I don't spend a lot of time agonizing over the supernatural or extra-dimensional origins of Thelema is that I don't think that's what gives it power. I think it is inspired, yes, but it is an inspired human system of thought, following from other systems of spirituality and improving on them. And Crowley, as a person, not any quasi-immortal oversoul or other part of him, is integral to that humanity. Perhaps the ideas in Thelema are inspired, but it's the humanness of it that appeals to me. It offers questions and dilemmas rather than packaged truths, but unlike many other systems, it is infinitely practical and possible. Ultimately, whatever his role as prophet is supposed to mean, Whether you think that's merely as a mouthpiece for some extra-dimensional being or as an example for us to learn from, Crowley left behind an ethical system which, if you actually read the whole material and think about the relationship of the parts, balances trying to take care of ourselves with a duty to care for others, and puts the human individual at the center without diminishing our responsibility to the universe. It fails to give over much false hope, but contrives a reasonable formula by which we might be immortal, at least in a manner of speaking. Crowley wasn't a great political thinker, and Thelema is not, by his own admission, a political fiefdom. Yet it does offer the potential to think our way out of the current chaos, a visual route by which we might, both as individuals and as a community, find a modicum of hope, and if we fully realize its promise, at least some limited control over our own destiny. Unlike Christianity, it does not tell us to emulate a perfect being and feel bad when we fail. Unlike Buddhism, it does not tell us that the world is pain and sorrow, so we might as well get used to it. It shares more than a little with Stoicism, which apparently has become quite popular on TikTok, or so I've heard. But as with Buddhism, it is more proactive. It gives us reason to learn to seek and find joy in multiple ways, and have no shame in doing so. So that's my case for Crowley. A flawed, struggling prophet for flawed, struggling people. But where other prophets taught us we will aspire and always fall short, Crowley holds out the promise that despite all our issues, we might just manage to make something of ourselves and experience some joy along the way. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you'll enjoy this greater feast with curry or some other tradition of your own making, with people you care for and love. For the Thelemic Order, I'm James Gordon. Love is the law. Love under will.